which takes time, takes often several generations. And it's about striking the balance between these two. In terms of ethnic change in Britain, what I'd say, a couple of things. First off is that there are benefits certainly to diversity, especially to immigrants who come, improve their lives, gain freedom, etc. The host society can gain benefits, particularly in the short term. But I would argue that as the society gets more diverse, the costs tend to rise and the benefits either stay the same or decline. So the calculus moves against large-scale immigration. There's three main sort of costs that I want to talk about today. And the first one is, and it all comes from an academic literature, which I won't go into a lot of detail in. The first is there's a tension between diversity and solidarity. Work of Robert Putnam, Alberto Alesina. There's work in international political science that more ethnically diverse societies tend to have a harder time having useful public goods because politics tends to run more on ethnic lines. Economic development tends to be lower in more ethnically diverse societies. We can have that debate why that is. It's not hard and fast. It's not a huge effect. So that's one thing. There is also the question of the white British as an ethnic group themselves. Do they have rights? Those rights, there's a book which I contributed to in Cambridge University Press on Majorities and Nationhood, edited by Ruud Koopmans and Leah Vorgaard. And Koopmans' argument is very much that as ethnic majorities decline, they gain more moral rights or more rights as groups. And so there's this question of the ethnic majority, its sense of loss and alienation, which is a major instigator behind populism, for example. The third thing is, what I really want to focus on more, though, is this idea of British national identity losing distinctiveness in the world. This idea of ethnic traditions, religious traditions of nationhood. So what makes a nation distinct in the world? If we take white Britishness, Protestantism, being located in Europe, liberal democratic traditions, at the confluence of all that, you have Britain defined, or at least it's a good part of its distinctiveness in the world. Now, that doesn't mean we want to go for optimal, maximal distinctiveness, but we just have to acknowledge that there is an erosion of distinctiveness as the ethnic composition moves away, as the religious composition moves away from what it's been historically. It's not to say that's a cost that's going to override everything else, but it's something we have to bear in mind, and I think as it now, I want to talk a bit more about this because the ethnic and religious traditions of nationhood, it's not just the property of white British people, it is the property of all people who identify with Britain, regardless of race or religion. I want to use an analogy with accent. The phrase, all accents are British accents. If I say all accents are British accents, at the individual level, that's true. Anyone who identifies with Britain, regardless of accent, is equally British to somebody who has call it a British accent, right? But at the level of the system of Britain as a whole, it's nonsensical to say that my accent is a British accent or somebody with an Indian accent is a British accent. It's simply nonsensical. So we have to distinguish between the collective, what's distinctive about Britain in the world, and the level of the individual. And very often people will tend to commit something called the fallacy of composition to shut down debates. And they will tend to reduce everything to the individual level. So, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating some stuff I said at the Battle of Ideas, but if, for example, I say there are British accents and there are Indian accents, and someone says, oh, are you saying an Indian person isn't equally British? No. But that's the kind of tactic. Oh, the NHS has problems. Oh, are you criticizing nurses and doctors? No. They're separate issues, collective in the individual. Likewise, if we say there are all ethnic groups are British ethnic groups, at the individual level, absolutely. You can be Rishi Sunak is English. He's English in terms of his national identity. All ethnic identities equally British or English. However, at the level of what defines England in the world, that's not the case. There are British ethnic groups and there are ethnic groups that are less archetypally British. And so you have a loss of identity there. So what we see actually, by the way, is in survey work, I'm a quantitative social scientist, ethnic minorities are often as likely, or almost as likely, to identify with these ethnic and religious features of nationhood. For example, in Canada, where I'm from, a survey asked, well, do you agree with this statement? There are too many visible minorities in the immigration flow to Canada. More non-white Canadians agreed with that. I think it was about 40% as white Canadians. So the point here is that also for minority Brits. There is a sense of what they're attached to, and part of what they're attached to in their national identity is a historical ethnic composition. Yes, it's changing, but they too don't want to see rapid transformation. So I'm trying to pitch this as this is not exclusionary, but we do have to think about this suite of issues, that is the loss of ethnic tradition, the loss of Britain's ethnic traditions, the solidarity diversity trade-off, and also white Brits as an ethnic group as they decline, gaining certain kinds of rights. All right, okay. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, loads there that we will come back to, I'm sure. So over to you, Paul Embery. He is a firefighter. He's also a commentator and writer. He wrote Despised, Why the Left Loathes the Working Class, but he comes from a blue Labour tradition. So let's hear from you, Paul.
Thank you, Inaya, and a proud trade unionist as well, I should say. And just punch me if I go over time. Okay. Please feel free, don't hold back. How should we think about white British ethnic decline? I think it's a valid question. It's a very valid question, because I think questions of ethnic cultural background and identity are very much at the forefront of the debate, political debate taking place in our country at the moment, and are very much shaping the contours, if you like, of the political debate. And of course, it's true to say that white people, it's not controversial to say that white people have the deepest and longest standing roots in this country, call them the native population, the indigenous population, or whatever. And I think it's also pretty clear that as a group, they are quite angry at the moment, and specifically the white working class. I think we need to focus very much, not exclusively, but we need to focus on the white working class, and we see it every day around us, I think. And I think probably for the first time in my lifetime, certainly since I've been active in politics, the white working class are now kind of coalescing around their own, if you like, unique grievances and demands. What are the reasons for that? I think they're manifest, to be honest. I think that they are pretty angry at a tin-eared, largely liberal progressive establishment, which has treated them with contempt for many years and looked down their noses at them and sneered at them. I think they have very deep concerns about the trajectory of our country. I think they are very worried about very rapid economic change and cultural change. These are often the group of people that have been impacted most by the worst aspects of globalization, in terms of deindustrialization in their communities, in terms of rapid demographic change in their communities. They're worried about economic insecurity, the levels of immigration, the levels of integration, and so on. And I think this sentiment has been festering. It hasn't come out of a clear blue sky. It's been festering for at least 20 years, in my view. These people have often, when they've raised concerns, been dismissed as reactionary and bigoted, almost as if they're kind of museum pieces now in this country who need to be dragged out of their ignorance by a much more intelligent group of liberal sophisticates who continually look down at them. And they tried to fight back by voting for Brexit. Brexit wasn't just about coming out of the European Union. Brexit, in my view, was as much an anti-UK elite vote as it was an anti-EU vote. But in truth, nothing has changed, or not enough has changed. And I think this group of people are probably demonised still as much now as they were then. They don't, frankly, subscribe to the precepts of cosmopolitan liberalism, which dominates our political and national institutions. And they are, I think, concerned about what they see as age-old social and cultural norms being upended at very rapid pace in their country. And we're seeing the blowback. We're seeing the blowback in terms of the protests over the asylum hotels, the big marches in London, the big political realignment that's taking place in the polls, the Raise the Colours campaign, which for me is not an aggressive campaign, but it's very much almost like a defensive campaign, because I think this group of people are looking at the way that identity politics has captured our country, and they're looking at a term that I think Eric coined, asymmetric multiculturalism, where we're constantly told, or they're constantly told, look, you have to celebrate enthusiastically every other culture, but you really have to downplay your own. And they are saying, what about us? That's what they're saying, what about us? So to sort of sum up, I think that the language of national renewal is talked about a lot now, isn't it? And it's Keir Starmer's kind of go-to phrase at the moment for his government's mission. If we are going to renew as a nation, we're not going to do it without that cohort of people, the white working class, who the establishment has done so much to alienate over the last 20 or 30 years. So if we're in the business of renewal, it's about winning back the hearts and minds of those people. That is a very, very big task.
Thank you. So we'll come back again to many of those really interesting thoughts. So Tryl, he is the director of More in Common, which is a opinion research organisation, very influential. You've probably seen him on, all the different shows talking about the budget and all of these different things as well. Yeah, I guess you'll probably tell us a bit more about what the polling and research and focus groups from the public, what they actually think on this topic.
Yeah, and thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming along. I think the first thing to say is that I think often the problem with debates and discussions like this is that we don't delineate very well, and so we group in a whole series of things which end up, actually I think they end up furthering some of the kind of demonisation and othering and points like that. So on the one side of the ledger we have, do people think the levels of immigration to the UK are too high at the moment? Yes, very, very clearly. People think that. Majorities of every voter group, every major voter group think that levels of immigration are too high. Do people want to see asylum hotels closed down? Yes, absolutely. And there's been a very clear shift there as well. Do people want to get control of issues like small boats? Yes, absolutely. Do people think there should be greater expectations on integration? Yes, as well. So you've got this on this side of the ledger. You've then got the other side of the ledger, which often sort of gets merged in, is do most English people take a definition of Englishness or have a definition of Englishness which is based on the colour of people's skin? No. Absolutely not. In fact, when we asked someone can be English regardless of the colour of their skin or ethnic background, or skin colour and ethnic background are important to whether someone is English, just 17% said that skin colour and ethnic background are important. 74% said that someone can be English regardless of the colour of their skin. So what people's concerns when it comes to issues around British identity, and there's no doubt there are also concerns about British identity. In fact, the strongest cleavage that we find between our more socially liberal segments and our more socially conservative segments is on the question of whether British identity is disappearing nowadays. It's we find 57% worry that British identity is disappearing, 43% think it is being strengthened by diversity. So there is clearly a challenge there, but the split between liberal groups and conservative groups is extremely stark. Progressive activists, just 10% think British identity is disappearing. Traditional conservatives, just 5% think British identity is being strengthened by diversity. So there's quite clearly a cleavage on that question. But when they're talking about identity, they're not talking, and I think this is the problem with this debate, they're not talking through the very narrow prism or the very exclusionary prism for which lots of English people say that your identity and your Englishness is defined by the colour of your skin. Lots of, it's not just us that find that. YouGov found similar. In fact, YouGov found only 6% of adults in England believe that someone can only be considered British if they're white. 13% say that you have to be white to be considered English. Similarly, Christianity, only 9% say that you have to be Christian to be English. So they're not taking that narrow definition of Englishness. But where the concerns are is when there isn't a focus on integration. People believe that this is a two-issue. There is an expectation that if you're in the UK, that integration is important. In fact, and you very rarely get polls like this, but 93% of the public say that those who come to the UK as immigrants have a responsibility to integrate with the wider public, including through learning English. That is Labour voters, Reform voters, Liberal Democrat voters, Green Party voters think that as well. So I think integration is where this debate needs to land. It is how do you, in a country which has had, let's leave aside future flows of immigration, has had significant immigration throughout its history, but particularly in recent years, how do you make integration work? And I think there are some encouraging signs here. You know, we often focus on the problems, and there are clearly problems, and there are clearly areas where integration isn't working as it should. But across Britain as a whole, 51% say that different ethnic groups interact with each other at least some of the time. So there is something there, you know. But on the other side, 39% say not much or not at all. So what can we learn from the areas where clearly that social mixing is happening and the areas where it isn't happening? And I'll just, I mean, there's lots more that I could say, but we are doing a very interesting project at the moment with UCL, which is looking at social connection. And what we tried to do was we mapped out across the country areas where people are most likely to say they feel connected with society around them, and areas where people are most likely to say they feel disconnected around them. And one of the things that we tried to look at was immigration. Was levels of immigration in that constituency correlated with social connection? It wasn't, but what was correlated was social mixing. So areas of high immigration and low social mixing, people were much more likely to say they felt disconnected from wider society. Areas of high immigration and high social mixing, they were much more likely to say they felt connected. So I guess what I'm trying to say through these open mics is this is a debate with lots of levels, and I think it's important that we get into each of them, and I think build on that kind of inclusive definition that most English people have of Englishness, and then think about, okay, what's the other side? What are the expectations and requirements that we're expecting from people who come to the UK?
No, really, really interesting. So I guess I've got a question just for each of you. So firstly, you, Eric, you kind of mentioned about group rights and the idea that, like, I think when the white majority might decline, they might start thinking about, you know, group rights. What do you think about that? Because to me, you've obviously been a critic of identity politics, and for a number of years, particularly around the kind of left, but you seem to be arguing almost sympathetically to the idea of group rights, and to me, like, that seems to contradict the idea. You know, I think that kind of creates kind of competitive racial grievance politics, but just doing that with the majority ethnic group or the largest ethnic group. So how do you square that?
Yeah, really good question, and you're right, there is a tension there. I mean, the first thing I'd say about identity politics, I don't tend to use this term necessarily the way others use it. The issue, say, with woke, for example, is, as John McWhorter says, it's not necessarily about groups having identity, but it's about subscribing to a religion of certain groups being higher and lower on an oppression pole. So it's about what he says, who is hurting who. So this is actually much more about a religion that worships oppression, rather than it simply be about groups being tribal. The way I think about identity is, for example, that to some degree we have to get past our tribalistic impulses, but to some, you know, people are, on the other hand, have a human nature. And so what Jonathan Haidt calls common humanity identity, where you have your identity, but you don't take a zero-sum approach. That's distinct from common enemy identity, where I have my identity because I dislike somebody for some reason. Maybe I think of them as the oppressor, whatever. So I think that's an important distinction. So I think a moderate identity that is about common humanity, but is still a group identity, is fine, actually.
So you think white people should start identifying as white and seeing themselves white politically?
Well, first of all, it's important to say, like, the research shows that, you know, if you ask, now granted this was mainly from the US, but I've done this in Canada and Britain as well, you know, roughly half of, you know, people from the white ethnic group, if you like, I mean, that's defined in different ways, do have a white identity. It may be moderate, may be strong, etc. So it does exist. It's not as strong as people who have a black identity or a Hispanic identity, for example, which is slightly higher. I think it exists. The question is always, what is the appropriate place for defense of group interests and for group concerns? You don't want to be completely hung up on it, because that's not the good society. You've got to surmount it. But equally, for us to pretend that people should just get over it completely, I think is also not realistic. And by the way, I should say, if we look at people's patterns of marriage, where they live, who their friends are, there is intermarriage, absolutely, and absolutely, and I'm partly a product of this. But equally, we got to be realistic that for most people, in fact, they're voting with their feet to some degree. The revealed preferences are such that there's more people affiliating with each other than there are with another race, for example. So there is mixing, but I think we would be naive to assume that everything's fine. That I just think we've got to balance.
On the topic specifically of group rights, do you think that white Britons? I think this is the thing, because I want this to be a kind of safe space. I think we should have everything out in the open, and I think we need to be really frank about what we're saying. So do you think, and maybe there is nuance for you and therefore it's not explicit as that, and that's fine, but I just want to know, like, what, in a general sense, do you think that there should be group rights for white people in Britain?
So with group, let's talk about group rights, right? Because usually in the multiculturalism literature, this might be about special dispensations, not having to wear a helmet if you're Sikh, or some kind of special. I'm not generally a fan of special exemptions from the norm. So I want individuals to be treated equally. However, there are certain domains. For example, a group's a right to express its identity without being called a racist, or a right to be proud of their identity. If you say I'm black and I'm proud, or I'm Asian and I'm proud, or that should not be a problem. Second might be thinking about immigration. Immigration levels and composition is going to shape the composition of Britain, and I don't think it is. Just as if a Hispanic person said, yeah, it'd be great if, or a Cuban said, it'd be great if we had more Cubans in the country. That's one sentiment. I don't think that's a racist sentiment, but equally I think for white British or white Americans to say, well, immigration is generally leading our group to decline, and we don't, we think that we want to decline more slowly. That kind of defensive group interest, I think, is reasonable. Whereas if you were to say, no, everybody must be us and anyone else must go, it's clearly extreme.
Cool. And just to you, Paul, I think what was interesting when you were mentioning about the kind of contempt from the progressive elite, to me, that also makes me think that on this question of like white, the white Britons aren't a monolith. They are as heterogeneous as any other group. And what I find in this conversation is that oftentimes it often misses the fact that I find the overwhelming majority of people that are like really pro-migration, really pro-diversity, really pro-multiculturalism are, white Britons. I think an example I often give is in Wales, which I think is like 95% white. They had like this anti-racist action plan, and there's very, very little minorities there. So what do you think of this idea that it's quite difficult to speak for white people, or that the kind of white working class or white this, when I find that there's such a wide range of views. Many, if not a significant minority, are very pro the kind of changes that we've seen societally.
Yeah, I think you can identify patterns and trends within different cohorts of people, and I think you can do that as much as within the white ethnic group, as much as any other ethnic group. You're absolutely right to say that no ethnic group is a homogenous, blob. Let's be blunt. There are people with different views and different opinions in all groups. But I think anyone who has been following politics to any degree in Britain over the last couple of decades or so, and following some of the data, and Luke can expand on this, I'm sure. I think it's undeniable that the further you go down, if you like, the social ladder in terms of when you get to the white working class, particularly when you look at some of those post-industrial communities in the North and the Midlands, or what you might call Britain beyond the M25, provincial Britain, blue-collar Britain, that kind of thing. There is, very much as I touched on, they kind of coalesce around a certain view, not exclusively, but there's very much a strong pro-Brexit sentiment. It's very much a strong patriotic sentiment, very much a sort of communitarian outlook. These people are often very rooted, they're very community focused, and I think that's to do in part with the fact that they don't have the kind of wealth or qualifications or opportunities available to them that more middle class liberals might have living in our fashionable cities and university towns. So I think that reality is undeniable. And I think, I often cite the example that I know best in Inaya, which is I grew up in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, lived there for 35 years. Very much a sort of white working class Labour stronghold. And around the turn of the century, it was very much caught in the eye of the storm of globalisation, started experiencing big changes, deindustrialisation. The big Ford plant in Dagenham, made in Dagenham, you know, was on its last legs, very rapid demographic change. And I set out the stats in my book in terms of the extent of demographic change. And that caused the white working class in that community a great deal of disorientation and bewilderment. And that disorientation and bewilderment, and I saw it with my own eyes, was dismissed by, if you like, the political and cultural elites as racism and innate bigotry and xenophobia. And for the most part, it wasn't that at all. Most people in that community, and I knew many of them, grew up with them, most people in that community were actually pretty decent, tolerant people. But they saw these rapid changes taking place around them, and they felt that their sense of belonging had been violated. And so many of them, thousands of them, it's worth looking at the data, moved out very quickly. They moved to places like the Essex coast or Kent and places like that. And it wasn't, I always say this, it wasn't that their sense of race had been disturbed or their sense of ethnicity had been disturbed. It was that their sense of order had been disturbed. So that was a flight to familiarity rather than white flight. It's really important to understand that, I think.
And Luke, one of the things that you were kind of touching upon is that people have concerns about integration, and it's, you know, perhaps it's wrong to understand that racially. But I guess this question kind of comes up and up again when I've been involved in these discussions. You know, what does one integrate into? And in order to make a point about integration, we've got to be able to say some things aren't integrated, right? And so, and that seems quite difficult to have in the public conversation. So before we even say what is integration, you know, can we point to parts of the country and say that that's not integrated? I think Robert Jenrick had said, you know, there's no white faces or whatever, and obviously there was a big backlash amongst the kind of media class about those comments. But is there validity to making the kinds of claims that he did? I don't know what the public think, but when we say we're not integrating or people aren't integrating, what does that really mean if we can't point to places that aren't actually don't fit what we think is Britain?
I'll come to that. I just wanted to actually just build on just something that,
Sure.
that Paul's going is really important, because actually we did, you know, some focus groups in Merthyr Tydfil this year, and it was sort of exactly the same experience of that dislocation that had been brought about through just the collapse of the industries. And I think what a lot of people miss is it wasn't just people changing jobs. I mean, the entire sense of community was linked to when you finished in a mining or a factory job, supporting what was happening in the mine. Social clubs, sports clubs were built around it, and we almost just did nothing, right? Like, I mean, yes, okay, there's some like help to work and retraining schemes, but all the evidence is that they weren't really good. But we did nothing to think about what it meant for the community and that sense of discombobulation. And so I think people are quite right to be angry about that, actually, that we just sort of said, well, the economy's moving one way, we're going in one direction, kind of, you know, get on board with the programme. So, you know, very much mirrors that. And I think that is a common shared experience because of that rootedness people have had as well. On the question about areas of the country that are, or places that aren't integrating. Look, so when we asked about Robert Jenrick's comments, I think we found a majority found that they thought the comments were fair. When we pasted the kind of full, it was the full paragraph of what he had said. I think more broadly, we need to be, and this is where I think occasionally you do have to start trampling on group rights, is be less squeamish about calling out things which do clash with British values. So I was a special advisor just over the road in the Department for Education, and I came into the Department for Education in the wake of the Trojan Horse scandal, and it is very clear there that what was happening needed to be challenged and it needed to be confronted for what it was through the lens of extremism, and it then triggered a debate around British values and teaching British values in school. Now, one of my regrets is I don't think we went far enough with British values and the way schools implemented it. Some of it was great. Sometimes they were like, oh, we're teaching British values, and kids had made like a sequined picture of the Queen, which is great and lovely, but it's not teaching British values, right? And I think we need to be, you know, and sometimes you have debates with more liberal audiences, like, oh, but they're not British values, they're universal values. Well, let's own them and make them British values. Similarly, though, you know, it doesn't just apply to one group. A lot of my time when I was at Ofsted as director of strategy was engaging with members of, you know, the ultra-Orthodox and Haredi community, because, you know, in some of the schools that are run by the Haredi community, you know, pupils aren't being prepared for life in modern Britain. So I think, you know, I think education is one area where we shouldn't be squeamish about placing greater expectations that kids get this broad education which prepares them for life in modern Britain.
Question for everyone on the panel. Just throwing this out there, because this has come up a lot, and you kind of just touched upon it there with the Trojan horse. To what extent is some of these anxieties to do with people's concerns about Islam? And I think that, like, I find that the examples that people often point to and touch upon and their concerns about integration, people often bring up, for example, Whitechapel, or they might talk about the burqa and talk about, you know, Sharia and different things like that. Obviously, there's a wider immigration conversation, but how does that play into it? The sense that obviously Britain has declined religiously, but there's perhaps a more confident religious group that is increasing, that people see as somehow, you know, a clash with the majority norms. What do you think, Paul?
I don't necessarily think there's an issue, a broad issue with Islam per se. I certainly think there is an issue with radical Islam. And I think, you know, when you consider that 15 out of the last 20 terrorist attacks in this country, I think I'm almost certain I'm correct in saying, have been carried out by Islamists. And when you see bollards around Parliament, and we know why they're there, and when you see police on patrol at Christmas markets, armed police, and we know why they're there, I think that people, not unreasonably, think, okay, this does pose a threat. I think on the one hand, you can say, look, we absolutely believe that people should have the liberty in a free society to follow the faith of their choice, to dress as they wish, to worship the God of their choice, to eat the food that they want. But actually, if it makes us worried about getting on the tube or going to certain places, because the more radical elements of it pose a threat, then I think we should be honest enough to have that debate. I think in terms of the broader issue about multiculturalism, I think some commentators have sort of distinguished in a correct way, I think, between, if you like, soft and hard multiculturalism. Soft multiculturalism being an acceptance that, you know, of course, as I said, individuals in a free society should have the right to follow the faith of their choice and dress as they wish, eat the food that they want, and so on. But I think what we've practiced in this country is hard multiculturalism, where we've actually gone out to people and actively promoted separateness and difference, and said to people, you are different from us. You're different from, if you like, the majority population and the majority culture, and you should celebrate that fact. And I think that that's created the kind of salad bowl situation rather than the melting pot situation, which I think is much better. I'm not convinced that we are anywhere near as integrated as a society as we claim to be. I wish we were, to be honest. I wrote a piece on my Substack recently. I cited three examples. You know, if you look at TV, for example, if you listen to the statements of politicians, we're this sort of wonderful, multicultural, integrated society. We have to face inconvenient truths sometimes. If you look at the London Marathon, for example, almost every face was white in the London Marathon, in a city which we're constantly told is very sort of diverse and multicultural. If you look at the celebrations, I watched them of VE Day, the 80th anniversary on the TV. Almost all of the events were white faces. I simply make that as an observation, not to make a sort of an aggressive or hostile political point, but simply as an observation. In Bradford, you know, very much a city which got a very large amount of ethnic diversity, their football team won or got promoted, and at the end of season celebration campaign, the city square, the parade, was absolutely filled with local people, almost exclusively white. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that people should be forced into activities or pastimes that if you don't like football, you don't like football. I'm simply making the point that we still have very different interests and very different backgrounds, and if we need to, we need to integrate people better, we need to recognise that we're still in the foothills, and for politicians to constantly, try to give the impression that actually it's all working very, very well is not true. We need to understand the task in front of us because it's really, really difficult.
Just sort of. Look, there is no. I think our research we're talking public is people don't have an issue with Islam. People don't have an issue with people practicing it. People very definitely have concerns about extremism, and Islamist extremism is one of people's top concerns. It is up there with far-right extremism, and interestingly, those who are concerned about Islamist extremism are almost as likely to be concerned about far-right extremism and vice versa. It is an either-or on that. I think where people, along with extremism, I think where people also get frustrated is when, in the interests of cohesion, we allow things to happen which contradict people's expectations of British values. So the example I would give is the teacher in Batley, who I think is still in hiding, because the approach that the council took was it is better to quieten this down, it is better to listen to self-appointed community leaders who are very often not representative of the wider community. And if you haven't read it, I urge you to read the case study in the Kahn report, Sarah Kahn's cohesion review about what happened in Batley, because it is such a failure, and that is what really annoys people. On the flip side, though, we've been doing some work recently talking to young people of different faiths, and there is a danger that some of the rhetoric that we are seeing, particularly online, but particularly which is going unchallenged, is leading young British Muslims, not just young British Muslims, but young British Muslims to feel that they can't identify as British. And so some of the focus groups we've done is young British Muslims saying, yeah, I really want to be British, but it looks like racism is on the rise now. It looks like anti-Muslim hate is on the rise now. It's making it much harder for me to feel proud of being British when this has happened. So I think, there's the integration piece, there's the tackling extremism piece, but we also shouldn't forget that we have to keep doing the tackling discrimination piece. That doesn't mean putting in place things which don't allow people to do legitimate criticism of religion, by the way.
I agree with that. What I would say is there's kind of two dimensions here, which I think are separate, actually, in psychological research are separate. Attachment to and dislike or fear of the other. People assume they're the same thing. They're actually quite separate in studies, repeated studies. So I think the Islam question falls into that box of fear, worry, some of which is justified, much of which is not. But that's, I think, a different question. Well, no, it's not. It's a relatively different question from the question of loss of the familiar. And so even if there wasn't a Islam dimension, we've seen it, for example, in the US, it was mainly Latinos and a large increase in the Latino population. But I think this decline of the white British is has a separate impact from Islam or any other worries around Islam. Now, of course, yes, if Islam grows substantially, and it is projected to increase substantially, or maybe double or triple by 2050, but those issues are going to be bigger, of course. But I also think right now what's driving the politics, for example, there have been scholars that have done experiments where they get white Americans, for example, to imagine the US losing its white majority. After they are put through that kind of experimental process, they're much more likely to support Trump, to support populism, all these sorts of things. I think there's something subliminal going on. Again, it's not everybody. People are wired differently. There are people who see change as loss and change as exciting. And that's a third to a half heritable as, and there's a whole literature on this around concept of authoritarianism. So yeah, I just think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that white British decline is a major, I would argue, a major driver of certainly national populism, independently of anything around integration, anything around Islam, because you're right. In a way, integration, certainly at the thin level, to speaking English, getting a job, participating, is pretty good in Britain, I would say. There are a few spots that are segregated. That's not, I think, as much the issue as I think the sense of loss amongst people who have a strong identification with group. Yeah.
I think just before I take it out to the floor, so please think about your questions and put your hand up in a moment. I guess my question is like solutions. So that was partly just touch upon my previous question, but to each person, because obviously, you know, we can talk about deindustrialization. I think a lot of the migration that we've seen is kind of baked in the sense that this has been happening for several decades now. And there are obviously clear, legitimate anxieties about a whole range of different things that feed into this particular discussion. And I think obviously you touched on the British values point, Luke, but I think some people feel that, yeah, as you said, British values, some could be wishy-washy sometimes, or that, you know, it's everyone's, like what's distinctly British. That's some of the questions that I hear people discussing. So it'd be interesting to know, like, practically, what can we do? I mean, I think net migration figures have come out today that have been a lot lower, I think, to 200,000 net. And I think a lot of people think immigration...
Everyone's buggered off.
Yeah. But it'd be interesting to hear each of you's sense of how we build, in light of the changes that have happened, but the fact that we all want to belong, we all want to feel, you know, rooted in our society and solidarity with others. How do we start to do that, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, you know, I mean, I often, when it comes to policy as opposed to public opinion, which is where I'm most comfortable, but if you start looking at some of the solutions, I have to default back to education because that's my sort of background. And one of the things which I've always found extraordinary, and I know you might all sort of think this is a bit sort of twee, but is the fact that, you know, you can essentially stop studying British history at the age of 13. Right, in this country. We don't have anything similar to the US concept of civics, for instance, which we expect, you know, they expect people to do throughout most of their school career when we have citizenship, but it's like, you know, it's a totally different thing. So I genuinely think there is something about that. Like, I think all young people throughout compulsory education should have to learn British history up to the age of 16. I think that is quite important for understanding and being part of the country. I also think there is a piece around the decline of shared spaces for social mixing as well. Some of you will have heard me say this before, but one of the most stark focus group quotes I had was a guy called Clive. He was a crane driver in Dudley, and he said, before the pandemic, we all used to have lunch together on the building site. Now we all sit in our cars. And they haven't gone back because actually lots of like messes have closed in workplaces as well. And actually there's a whole series of reasons why that social mixing is good. One is, you know, it also leads to, you know, sometimes linked in this topic is the rise of conspiracy thinking, but that's in part because we've closed down what I call come off it moments. When you go to the pub, you be with people different to you and say, oh, come off it, you know. Instead, we get a whole series of you're so right moments, because the moment you look at your phone, you're not looking at people saying come off it, you're looking at people saying, oh, you're so right, keep going. And so I think, you know, if I had two things, it would be thinking about space, and then secondly, that education and British history piece.
I think on that final point that Luke raises, it's, and I've raised this within the trade union movement, it's a serious problem for trade unions. Actually, you know, working from home has its benefits, of course, in terms of work-life balance and so on, but it's creating a real problem for us in the trade union movement, you know, which thrives, or did, on the workplace, on people being together and having a branch meeting, having debates, difference of opinions and voting and so on. I don't think that's something that the movement has got to grips with, and it is a problem when you think about young workers as well, joining a company and all of a sudden they're going into an office where no one else is there because everybody's working at home. So I'm not making a case against working from home, but I don't think we've confronted some of the problems. The big thing I think we need to, or one of the big things we need to do, it's easy to say it and we can have a whole debate about it another time, we need to get growth in the economy. We need to get people's living standards up. They've been through the global financial crisis. They've been through the cost of living crisis. People are struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to pay their energy bills. And when people feel that way, then when you get the big cultural changes taking place around them as well, it's almost like a perfect storm. You know, I've always said that I think some people will have that trade-off where if they can see that their living standards are improving, they've got more money in their pocket, they're more prosperous and so on, they can see big changes taking place around them, and they think, well, actually, you know, it's benefiting me. But when those changes are not offset by that feeling of feeling better off, then it does potentially become toxic, I think. People want economic security, but they want cultural security too. We have to be blunt about that. And of course, reducing immigration numbers to a level that is sustainable is a key thing, being much better in terms of integration policy, challenging the sort of hard multiculturalism that's been promoted for so long now. And I think, uniting people, I mean, one of the things that really disturbs me at the moment is this growing trend, people making the case for remigration. I'm hearing things now that actually we weren't hearing, we did in the 1970s when the NF were on the march. But thank God some of those arguments became, fringe arguments. You see those arguments now kind of re-emerging, and it tells you the seriousness of the challenge that we've got on our hands. And of course, remigration isn't the answer. We need to find the best way to unite people, but we need to do that within what I would call an overarching national culture, the majority culture, which doesn't kind of separate people off, allows people the liberty, of course, to follow their own culture, but actually says, a bit like I cite the example, a bit like Japan, which doesn't really go in for hard multiculturalism, which does defend its own culture, but is still very much a kind of peaceful and law-governed and civilised society. So the idea that you have to do things the way that we've done it in this country in order to be seen as forward-thinking and civilised, I think is absolute nonsense.
Yeah. Wow. What to do about it? I mean, I take the view this is almost entirely cultural and demographic. I don't think the economic side actually is going to make much. It's great. It would be great to have growth. I think that's fantastic. But if you look at the rise of national populism, for example, very little connection with anything economic. If you look at the data, if you just take the 07-08 financial crisis, compare that to the 2015-16 migrant crisis in terms of impact on national populism, is not to be compared. What I would say is I also don't think integration policy, other than getting people in the labor market, absolutely, and I agree with trying to get people mixing in history, but I think you will struggle to find, for example, an integration policy that has reduced residential segregation. That almost essentially in a free society. I'm not talking about Singapore.
What about Denmark? Did they not do
Well,
anti-ghetto laws?
I would, yeah. Okay, so if you are essentially putting in laws that are restricting people's freedom of where to live, I'm not sure we want to go there. But what I'm saying is, yeah, Singapore tells you where you can live, whatever. But in a free society where people can choose where to live, I am not aware of any successful integration. And I really think talking about integration policy, which is this debate's been going on for decades, I just don't think that's in any way realistic. I think what is realistic are a couple things. One, slowing the immigration rate to allow deep level assimilation, which takes a number of generations actually. The US case, for example, it took 3-4 generations for the Italians and Poles and Jews and others to melt. And I think realistically there's going to have to be a much more serious pause in the numbers. And so I think that's really the only way to allow this to happen organically, the melting to occur, is going to take a much more severe pause on slowdown in immigration. And I guess my view is that also, this is echoing a bit what both Luke and Paul have been saying, but when you get a commentariat that is always emphasizing difference over commonality and that is going after the history of the ethnic majority as being shameful, that is saying that ethnicity is valuable when it's expressed by minorities and it's sinful and to be discouraged when it's expressed by majorities, I think you are stoking a problem. I still, however, think long-term the only solution is to have a slowdown that will allow that deep integration to happen organically.
Okay, I think we should open up to the floor, but there's actually a question that came to my mind, and maybe we can touch upon it later, and you kind of touched upon it, Paul. I mean, how should we also approach what seems to be the rise in ethno-nationalism? And I don't really know if this is, it's not something I've actually encountered in my day-to-day life, but it's something that I see increasingly online. Now, I don't know how much weight one should put onto that, but there are clearly individuals, whatever the incentive structure on X, that are gaining traction and gaining influence by making certain kinds of arguments, like you mentioned, remigration, all this kind of stuff. So it'd be interesting to come back to that. How should we approach that? But also this point about how do we make sure we do stick to our kind of opposition to discrimination and so on and so forth. So hands up, and we'll take a few questions at a time. Okay, Great. The lady in the back there. We'll take a few questions at a time.
I guess my observation is that whether you call it hard multiculturalism or asymmetric multiculturalism, is that the biggest drivers of those are middle-class white people and not people from ethnic minorities. And I'd be interested in the panel's kind of thoughts about what is driving that, and also what would need to change in order for them to kind of take their foot off the gas a bit with that kind of approach, which I think we've kind of alluded to isn't super helpful.
Cool. Keep your hand up, sorry. This gentleman over here.
I forget which one of you said it, but you said that social mixing was the most important. Yes, you. Does it therefore follow that we should just outright ban religious schools?
Cool. The gentleman in the front right here. Just pass the mic over.
In terms of social change and population turnover, what do you think is the relationship between higher abortion rates and lower birth rates amongst white British vis-a-vis the opposite rates of abortion and birth rates in immigrant communities? And how has the political establishment exacerbated this through hyper-individualism and bad economics, as well as much as immigration policies?
Interesting. You had your hand up just behind, yeah.
Hypothetically, Dr. Kaufmann, what group rights would a white identity-oriented group, or could they ask for, apart from, I guess, lowering immigration or something?
Although the majority of minorities actually also support reducing migration, to be fair. We'll just take one more question. Yeah, this guy at the back here.
My question was something that you two both touched on right at the end, which was to do with, I guess, what you call ethno-nationalism, or at least what I've seen is, I guess, a turn against the desirability of integration to begin with. Like you said, it's something you see a lot more online. Like anytime you go on someone like Zia Youssef or Ben Habib's page, half the, they'll be saying whatever, people need to integrate and if they want to come into this country. And a decent portion of the replies will be saying, no, we just want them to go, and you two go back to Pakistan or something. And so I guess, maybe basically just repeating what you were saying, is this a kind of real thing we're expecting to see growing in society, or is it just Twitter?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I just want to add a point to that, because one thing that's really struck me is the seemingly right-wing turn against Catherine Birbal Singh School Michaela. It was increased, like before it was seen as like this amazing example of integration, and that you can make non-white, non-Christian children really patriotic. But I've seen increasingly people saying, well, this actually shows how authoritarian you need to be in order to make groups see themselves as British. So that, I think that it's interesting that, and then you're seeing like people like Zia Youssef and other patriotic ethnic minorities, are not kind of, are seen as a problem as well on some sections of the right. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that, Eric, at some point. But question on white liberals and how you stop this kind of move that we're seeing, religious schools, birth rates and abortion rates, and what I just touched upon. So do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean,
pick up on anything.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to cover everything,
No.
but certainly in terms of the woman's question at the beginning, this kind of agenda in terms of hard multiculturalism being pushed by white liberals, quite often middle class, progressive, as I said earlier, living in our fashionable cities and our university towns. I think there's whole reasons as to why that kind of thinking came about, and we could have an entire debate. And I think what happened in terms of some of the cultural revolutions that took place in the 60s probably began some of that. And I think some of the people who were responsible for some of the fundamental changes throughout the 80s and 90s had their politics rooted in those sort of revolutions, and came of age in the 80s and 90s and started putting their stamp on public life and within our political parties and institutions and so on. But I also think that it's kind of seen today by people who kind of mix within those circles, and you know, members of the professional and managerial classes, almost now like it's almost like a qualification that you know, this is what you have to believe because this is what we all believe in our kind of circle. And people, I think, I use the term, they seek the metropolitan embrace because they think it wins social kudos amongst other people within their own circle, and you know, they get approval from people who write nice columns for The Guardian and live in North London and host kind of dinner parties. I don't want to caricature it, but there is a certain truth in that, if we're perfectly honest about it. And there's an element of social kudos to be won, as I say, from people if they articulate those feelings. But in doing so, and this particular sentiment, this ideology, has you know, largely captured, I think, our political and cultural and academic institutions, and that's why that chasm has emerged. People who have those views and drive it forward, increasingly as they've done that, that chasm has widened between them and ordinary people out there who don't hold that view. And I think because of that, the trust in our institutions and our corporations has diminished pretty substantially.
But how do we change that? Because obviously, if
I
it's
think,
just
well,
going to keep going, then the problem's going to get worse.
And you know, people have said we almost need a kind of reverse Gramscian march through the institutions. We need to kind of do it the other way. And I think there's a certain truth to that, to be honest. But I also think, you know, I'm a bread and butter trade unionist. I know that you win by organisation and pressure. You win by winning people over to your argument. It's never easy. But I think as the tensions kind of deepen in society, in our society, which I think they probably will, and as the argument becomes more acute around things like national and cultural identity, and particularly now we're seeing another political realignment, you're seeing the two big parties, you know, under 40%, that is almost unprecedented. The two big parties continually getting between them under 40%, and the rise of Reform and the rise of the Greens. I think as that sharpens, that realignment sharpens, I think these debates will become unavoidable, and the space then gets created, you know, for people to bring about change. It won't be easy though.
Yeah, no, that's that. And Eric, what about the individualism point? I think that's quite interesting, this idea that, you know, if we look at the white majority, they are voluntarily choosing to have less children, and also, you know, are supporting the kinds of values that, you know, I guess give rise to perhaps even less solidarity in society because people focus on their own individual self-interest. And then you get other communities that, you know, have large families for very moral, religious, and right reasons. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a big question. What I'd say, first of all, I'd say that non-white communities are converging very quickly on birth rates. So I don't actually think that's an enormous difference, especially as we get into the second generation, third generation. I would say if you take the white community, let's say, or the white majority here or in the US or wherever, they are the ones that are investing most in political identity, so they're the most polarized. You know, actually, if you take African Americans, for example, they're not really polar. I know most of them vote Democrat, but actually, you know, ideology doesn't line up with politics, doesn't line up with consumer choice. They're not as into this political religion. So I think what we're seeing is this real polarization amongst the white majority. It's also spilling over elsewhere to some extent. I don't think I mean, you asked about abortion. I don't think abortion is a major, I know there are people out there making these, I don't think it's a major factor behind the fertility collapse, for example. I don't actually think it's a major driver. So you have countries where abortion is much lower, maybe in Southern Europe, where this is not helping their birth rate. So I think that's I would kind of like to bracket that question. I'm just trying to think what else. Yes, so the question about white liberals, I think somebody asked that. Yeah. So really what we're living through is the making sacred of racial, sexual, gender minorities. This all happens really with the civil rights movement in the mid-60s, which was very important and did many good things, but it radically transformed our culture. And suddenly we had extremism. Already by 1966, you had commentators on the liberal left, not even the Marxist left, the liberal left talking about white people as the cancer of human history. That's 1966. Boom, all of a sudden. They were not talking about this before that moment. This is like a religion, and it's been going for decades. Now, what I'd say, however, is a couple of things have changed in the last few years. I think that what I would call cultural socialism has suffered a number of defeats. On the trans issue, I think if you look at survey attitudes, and be interested in what Luke thinks, but everything I've seen has shown attitudes have moved against the trans activist position. That's a big defeat for a movement that's been winning every cultural battle for 60 years. I think that the performance in the West Coast cities with drug abuse and with crime and all of these things, I just think there's now more of a willingness for people to say, actually, this is not the end of history. This is not like an inevitably rising belief system. So I think there's a crisis in that cultural leftism. And I think that's extremely important now. So I think that the energy behind this movement, which multiculturalism is a part of, it's hit its peak of influence. I don't think it's going any higher. The only question is, how quickly do we backpedal from that? And I think it's going to be really interesting, because I think the point is, if you look at all the professions, not just academics and not just journalists, but tech, medicine, law, all of the younger graduates are all way more left-wing. And they're transforming all these professions. They're all going well. But I think at some point that culture is going to shift. Now, I'm somewhat optimistic, but I think that has to change before we can have a more grown-up conversation about any of these issues.
Yeah, it could be interesting to hear your thoughts, especially about the religious schools one as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, and I'll come to sort of religious schools. I mean, it is interesting, but it's a sort of asymmetric pendulum swing back. So the pendulum certainly has swung on attitudes to trans rights, but support for same-sex marriage, it remains quite strong. Like, Reform UK voters are as likely to support same-sex marriage as the public as a whole. So I think people are differentiating amongst issues much more than they were. And I actually think, I'm just going to do this first because I think it links to the point about what we're seeing with some of the stuff online, which, hey, for people who are seeing, let's call it what it is. Like it is just like open racism being posted on X now, and that should be called out. And that, clearly is, people who are seeing that, it's terrible for them. The thing which maybe gives me hope in the longer term is that I now think there are elements of the online right who are making the mistake that progressives made in the 2020s of assuming that X is Britain, and they are misinterpreting as well. So I think the pendulum is swinging that way. Now, again, we know when the pendulum swings, even in the time it takes to go back, as we saw from some of the progressive excess, a lot of damage can be done during that period. So how can we learn from that? And how can people, particularly people of a conservative disposition, play a role in challenging that? But also, let's not think, I think, liberals are sometimes guilty of furthering this, because if you classify someone who makes an openly racist if you put someone who wants to fly the St. George's Cross outside their house, if you say, oh, they're the same, they're all racists, like, you make it much harder to challenge the genuine racism as well. So there is something incumbent upon people on making that distinguishing point. On the point about faith schools, look, the truth is that lots of the stuff, and I slightly disagree with Eric on integration, in the sense that I don't think we've tried hard enough to make it work. And some of the stuff on integration will require compromising other rights, right, in order to do it. Now, I happen to think that banning faith schools or stopping faith schools probably is a step too far. I also think it's probably not the biggest problem in this area, because one of the bigger problems is more monolithic catchment areas are leading to a lack of mixing there. What I do think, though, is if you are a faith school, or indeed any school, there should be much greater requirements placed on social mixing. Again, back when I was in education world, it sort of drove me mad, this idea that you would never there was never any expectation that you would, mix with other schools, even schools which were sort of, in the same area, but just had quite different intakes. And I think we could place much more of a forcing mechanism there, which wouldn't involve getting rid of faith schools.
Just a quick question before I go back out to Tryl. How receptive do you think any of the parties are to that? Because I think there's often things said about integration very vaguely. Obviously Keir Starmer's island to strangers, but I've not seen any policy really from Labour, for example, that sees this as a kind of piece that really needs to be grappled with on its own terms, and or from the Conservatives or Reform. Do you get a sense that anyone's actually taking this seriously as a piece of work that needs to be like looked at and done something about?
So I think the government are looking at the moment. The one thing I would say was that during my time, both as a special advisor and at Ofsted, the areas where I encountered the greatest squeamishness from working with Number 10 and the wider government was on questions of integration, because the government were just unwilling to do that piece, which does involve saying sometimes to groups, look, we are going to compromise some of your rights in order to place a greater premium on integration. That's not all of the rights, but it is some of the rights. And the resistance there was really strong because, of course, when you do it, you have to do it across different religious groups as well. So I think that there has to be a much greater degree of bravery of the government to say that, let's leave it. I mean, I also, we know the public want lower immigration. Even if we had lower immigration, we've still got a big challenge that we've got to do something about. And if we're not brave in dealing with that, I think.
Cool. Let's go back out to the floor. Jan, did you want to ask a question?
Thanks. I have to say, I find whenever I try to think things through in terms of race or ethnicity, it ends up as an intellectual and political cul-de-sac. I can't get anywhere with it. And because as soon as you try to, say, oh yes, it's clearly this is going on, and this group must feel that this is what the polling says, you can immediately contradict it with something else or something from a different experience. So I just think there's deeper trends here that immigration and race and ethnicity are being used as a simple way of trying to understand something much deeper. And one of them is the dissolution of civic life. And that is happening whether you're in Tower Hamlets or whether you're in Oxfordshire. You can be in a totally white town and clubs, civic institutions are falling away and people do not know how to rebuild them. They've lost the instincts. And that's happening amongst white British people of any class. So I think we can't explain it through immigration. However, the attack on the demos that's happened for the last 25, well, probably longer, 30 years perhaps, has happened through, I would say, in part, the ideology of multiculturalism. So the stripping away of the way in which you might treat the British population with dignity and respect, part of the way in which that has been done has been through the labelling of them as racist. And I think now we've got a reaction to that. So insofar as people are maybe identifying with their white ethnicity, which, to be honest, is utterly meaningless. As soon as you just ask the next question beyond are you white or not, there is nothing there. There's nothing there to unite us around our ethnicity. I'm Scottish, I'm Welsh, but I've raised British kids in London. Where on earth does the white bit come into that, other than as a reaction to something else? And that's why I think it's a totally negative cul-de-sac. But we need some other kind of way of conceptualizing these things, which I don't think is anything other than political. It can't be sociological, psychological. It's got to be some kind of political leadership that needs to be thinking about these things really differently.
Thank you. The gentleman with the green jumper.
There's a lot of sense of what was just said there, and maybe to that point, I wanted to ask the panel, what do you think about the apparent sort of wilting, if you like, of the Labour government when it comes to immigration? Shambhala Mahmood's latest plan, it feels like there was an attempt throughout the past year for Labour people to try and grasp towards a language about immigration that would fit them. You had the Islands of Strangers moment, and Starmer sort of retracted that phrase, but was clearly trying to work in this direction. So I was interested to know, do we think that it seems like the bipartisan consensus now that immigration has to be controlled is actually a permanent shift in official thinking?
Then you can go after the guy next to you.
Thank you. Just in addition to what's been said, I mean, Eric, your data, which you did, I think, 10 years ago for Policy Exchange, I think you found that there was a correlation between Eastern European migration and Muslim migration. But you also found, I also saw with one of your papers that areas where there was more diversity and where there were more immigrants, actually the white population of all classes on ward level were more pro diversity. So I just wanted to see whether that also, whether that links to what you're saying, and also in terms of some of the stuff that More in Common has found, but also I think a lot of the stuff on identity politics and hard multiculturalism and whatnot. I mean, Luke, you found that, for example, there's quite low levels of ethnocentric identity, and that's actually something that's declined over the last 30 odd years. If you look at, for example, I think the BSA, they find it's actually a lot higher. So, this sort of narrative, I think, that hard multiculturalism, not that I'm a supporter of it at all, necessarily leads to racist attitudes. I just wanted to question. I also want to just quickly add, in terms of identity politics and a lot of this stuff and multiculturalism, I do think we should always be careful, as skeptics of this, that we don't end up in a situation where you're removing agency of racists. I think if, people, for example, on the liberal left would say, oh, of course, all these problems with woke progressivism is bad, but oh, this is because of racism, this is because of transphobia, this is because... I think there's a tendency, I think, on some on the centre-right to assume that, oh, of course, these are really awful things, but it's exclusively down to white liberals or the liberal left or the woke. And I think I think people need to be quite careful of that, because, when we do that, you sort of erase sort of the moral and intellectual agency of people as well. So I just wanted to just put that to all of you, basically.
Thank you. Okay.
What I don't understand is how you can talk about this question without discussing class. I think that's a massive element to this. Well, that's what I was just about to say. I think Paul's the only one really who's talked about community. I think that's really important. Of course, economics and culture are intertwined, but I think a lot of it's about perspective. Whether you think a lot of the roots of these problems are economic, or whether you believe a lot of the roots of these problems are cultural. And a lot of the time, I think the economic problems, it's also a battle of survival within a lot of the groups in this country. It's a battle of, your communities, you're actually just trying to get by and actually make connections with people in your communities. And because communities being so kind of destroyed, and deindustrialization, of course, but also small businesses have gone under so much recently. I just want to know all of your thoughts on class.
Yeah, I think that touches upon the first question from Jan. Just we'll take a couple more before we go. Guy in the back. Oh, did you have a question?
Well, it's sort of observation with questions attached.
Okay. Well, keep it short.
Yeah, I come from Portsmouth. Portsea Island, primarily an island city, an island on the island of Britain, and it's a dockyard city that is completely run down, being basically replaced by a big university, which is politically and visually very different to the local population. Portsmouth has always embraced outside people because it's a dockyard city. That's not the problem. It's where the city has changed so quickly, and I'm a taxi driver. We get conversations where people feel embarrassed, but they talk in a taxi differently to how they feel. And this is an uncomfortable conversation, but it's important we have open conversations here. If the majority decent Muslim population spoke out more against radical Islam, if the black on black knife crime, what we've got in Portsmouth now, there's always been punch-ups in Portsmouth for hundreds of years, but it was never knives. But we've got that culture now, and people are saying, if I had a 17-year-old, my daughter doesn't like going out no more, she's in her 30s. If you, like your young girls, surely you wouldn't object if it's done in a decent manner to protect your own kids. That's what we get in the taxi all the time. It's an open conversation we need, and we can all get on then.
No,
I feel quite emotional about it.
Oh. Well, we try and have open conversations, and I think it's really cathartic societally.
Honest conversation, it's going to go round in circles.
I agree with you. Sorry.
Hi, sorry. Yeah. I want to ask, to what extent is this more really a question about English identity or the lack of it? I think that there are reasons why England doesn't really have a sense of civic nationhood, and the reason is that countries usually develop that through an independence struggle, and funnily enough, we've never had to do that. I think the sad truth is that I guess I'm not really sure what it means to be white English. This is a different conversation to be having in Scotland or Wales, as has been touched on a little bit. But what are the cultural trappings of white Englishness? I don't know. I almost wish somebody could tell me. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I'm from Harlesden, and it's interesting to see how I almost think that in terms of the ethnic makeup of certain demographics, we kind of can't keep up with the problems that are happening. So before, Harlesden was very Caribbean, and yet we have, you know, we have a lot of those kind of like intercultural, interracial issues there. But now it's less Caribbean, and we have like a much higher Somalian population, for example. You don't really see women on the street so much anymore. So it's almost like we have kind of a new wave of issues when the old issues haven't really been dealt with. And we're kind of struggling to keep up with the like the very urgent issues that are happening within the community. So what do you do with that? And then the other question I wanted to ask was, I saw on Instagram last year an acquaintance, or maybe it was a few years ago, but an acquaintance had kind of recently received her passport. I think she's Southeast Asian, and she kind of made this comment about, oh, I've received my passport for this bloody country. I don't even want to be here, but I've got my passport now. So what do you do about people coming to this country who don't actually love this country? It's so kind of easy to receive your citizenship, and yet you have no appreciation of the kind of the benefits of being here.
No, that's a really important question. Was there any other question before we go back to the floor? Anyone that hasn't asked the question? Okay. Anyone want to pick up first? Eric, go for it.
Sure. I mean, Jan talked about this idea of white, and I mean, I guess it's a bit like saying, you know, a lot of these things are great in moderation, and they're terrible if taken to an extreme. To try and assume these things don't matter at all, I think will lead to a backlash and a reaction. So I think, for example, that it's like with ethnicity. I mean, people have ties to ancestors. I mean, ethnicity is about ancestry. I don't think we can wish that away, but equally, we shouldn't get obsessed with it. But I would equally be worried about trying to suppress it. I think some of the problems we're having is suppressing those conversations, like the one we're having tonight, right? I think the ethnic composition issue does matter. It's not the only thing, and maybe in the distant future, when there's been melting and there's a Beijing, it's not going to be much of an issue anymore. But right now, it is an issue. People have certain attachments. I think we got to be realistic about that. So that's one thing. The question, I don't think this is mainly about locality or class. I mean, the data, I'm afraid, just doesn't back up the economic or class, or even, you know, I agree there's a problem with the economy. I agree there's a problem with civic life and the decay of civic life. But when you have rapid ethnic shifting, in the United States in the 1920s, you had very huge, incredibly strong civic associations, and they had a huge populist upsurge because of large-scale immigration. I don't actually think that is the major cause of what we're seeing. The reason we're seeing rise of national populism is immigration and ethnic change, I'm afraid. That is overwhelmingly the reason for it, regardless of what happens on the economy or even repairing civic life. I don't want to be too negative about this, but I'm thinking without allowing time through a pause on immigration for natural organic melting to occur, we're going to see continued rise of populism and polarization. So I just don't think the class picture, part of this picture, or the economic part of this picture is anything like a major part of the story, I'm afraid. The data doesn't back that up, at least in my view.
What about just the point that Renee at the back asked about, that I think you had previous research that said that people were more receptive to?
Good question. Yes, so this is quite tricky, right? There's a couple of points I'd make, just broad brush. One is local effects are relatively small compared to national effects. I think it was, maybe it wasn't you, but there's a survey that said, you know, is immigration a problem in your local area? 20%, nationally 70%, right? Is that people are thinking nationally on immigration and populist issues? Now, it is true that more diverse local communities, the whites there are slightly more tolerant, maybe 10 points more on immigration. But if we then zoom out to the scale of the city or the local authority, more diverse local authority, more diverse cities, the whites are actually less tolerant of immigration. So it depends on which geography we're talking about, but locality-wise, you're right. What's ironic is you've got, in fact, if you drill down locally, more diverse local area, the whites are more tolerant. they're also less trusting and less attached to their community. Because diversity and attachment to community are inversely correlated. And even when you control, there's been meta-analyses of these, even when you control for socioeconomic status and various other things, population density, it still reduces solidarity as measured by, would you return a wallet, or even did you return a wallet? These sorts of questions.
Yeah. So on the question about, I guess, sort of immigration policy and where has it shifted? I mean, look, I think all of the evidence is that the policies which Shabana Mahmood announced, last week on both asylum and ILR chime with median British public opinion, and they chime with Labour 2024 voters are, which is we need to have greater control. There needs to be greater expectations placed, and I guess this comes to your point on what it means to become a British citizen, and there needs to be a proper pathway which is based on contribution. And I do think, I accept what the data on economics said, but I do think that the two end up being linked in that I think one of the biggest problems we have in terms of public mood at the moment is people don't think that contribution is rewarded, and people think that respect for contribution has declined, and that has a migration element. It also has an element in debates around welfare. It also is why people were so angry about the winter fuel allowance, because people are like, I've worked all my life, and suddenly, I'm losing, whatever you think about the winter fuel allowance, that was where the debate came from. So I do think we have moved to a place. I'm interested in what Paul thinks, because he's been very critical, I think, of the failure for people to acknowledge people's frustrations in this area. I do think we are moving to an area where people have started to recognise that this is, that this is an issue, and it will be interesting to see if the, Shabana Mahmood's plans lead to. Lead to meaningful change, because obviously the proof is in the pudding there. On the point about having honest conversations, I think honest conversations are really important. I think when we don't have honest conversations, and I would use the example of the grooming gangs. It's the most perverse thing. Sort of in the name of cohesion, we didn't properly explore what was happening with grooming gangs. Now, not only has there been, most importantly, a grave injustice to the victims of that scandal, but we've also made cohesion worse because we've sort of sort of legitimised it. So I absolutely agree on honest conversations. One thing I should say, though, is I think that I do think it's slightly unhelpful is this, well, why don't more Muslims call out acts of Islamist terrorism? Thomas Mebb, the person who killed Joe Cox, I don't feel, I will call it, I think it's despicable what happened, but I don't feel that I personally, as a white English person, should have to call that out. And I think there is a danger that we push people in another direction. Again, this comes from our work, talking to British Muslims who say, again, I really want to be part of Britain, but I feel like I'm blamed every time there's a terrorist attack. And so I think we've got to be really careful there that we're not placing expectations that we wouldn't do on others. But yeah, and just to come back to that point, I think we need to have a much bigger debate about what it means to become a citizen and what expectations we place on people when they become a British citizen. And I think contribution, engagement. I know lots of people have mocked, one of the, I think, conditions which I think the government is looking at is like volunteering and being part of the community. But I actually think that's quite an important element there. And okay, maybe it's unworkable, but actually, yes, there's the, have you paid in? Have you learnt English? Have you done this? But I think there is also something about what are you also doing locally?
I think that's, before we go to Paul, it's interesting you said that, Luke, because I think people do have a responsibility. Like if like someone that was saying that they were doing something in the name of white identity, I would expect, everyone of course will call it out, but I would look to like white people to go, oh wait, that's kind of like, that's, you don't speak for me kind of thing. And I do feel as a black person more of a responsibility to kind of bring to awareness or call out things that are done in the name of black people, because other people may not feel like they understand the internal dynamics within those communities, so they may not feel like they could really comment on it. So it's interesting, because just comment on what you say, because I do think that Muslim people do things in the name of Islam and emerge from certain communities, it is more incumbent on people to stand up, because it's quite hard as an outsider. Does that make sense?
But you're doing it from a sort of explanatory piece rather than a, you're sort of saying that actually it's important to say that this isn't reflective of wider views rather than it being incumbent because they somehow have some kind of guilt and have to call it. And I think that's the tension. I think sometimes it's framed as because you are a Muslim, you are in some part responsible for the actions of people who commit terrorist acts, and I think that is problematic.
No. I think that's an important distinction. Paul, is there anything you want to pick up on?
Yeah, but just on that final point, I mean, David Lammy, before he went a bit bonkers, you know, some years ago, he used to speak and write about the impacts of fatherlessness in black communities and the impacts on particularly young black boys, and he used to speak and write in a very sort of cerebral way, in a very powerful way. And of course, it's undeniable. The fact that he was a black man himself who was brought up in London added gravitas to what he was saying. It's a difficult one because, of course, you know, when something bad happens, you don't want to kind of tar everybody with the same brush. Of course you don't. But I think the difficulty is because we have become a society that, you know, promotes hard multiculturalism and that divides people into these different identity groups and talks about all of the good things. So, for example, you know, the people in authority and the cultural elites and, you know, various progressives and so on will talk about black culture when it suits them. They'll go along to the music of Black Origin Awards and all of the kind of good stuff. But then don't want to talk about, you know, black culture when it comes to disproportionately higher knife crime and the reasons for that. And we shouldn't be squeamish about that. Of course, we shouldn't, you know, go up to somebody in the street and say, you're a black man, condemn, you know, black on black knife crime. Of course, we shouldn't do it in that crude way. But I think there is a conversation to be had about, okay, look, you know, if we want to promote the good sides of a culture, we have to accept as well, if we're honest, that there are negative sides, which we need to have an honest debate about. Just want to touch on Shabana Mahmood. I mean, Blue Labour, of which I'm a part, has won the argument on this. Let's be blunt. I've been involved with the group for some years now. Maurice Glasman is a good friend. And a few years ago, Blue Labour was pretty toxic in terms of the upper echelons of the Labour Party. Hardly any MP would want to be anywhere near it. John Cruddas was a bit of an exception. That most people thought it was that kind of right-wing, anti-immigration, reactionary group, not in tune with our progressive credentials as a party. At the Labour Party conference just a couple of months ago, there were 3, I think it was, MPs on the platform at a Blue Labour event, a Blue Labour panel fringe meeting. That, to me, signals a real shift. I think, and you look at Shabana Mahmood's proposals. Shabana Mahmood is pretty Blue Labour, by the way. Let me tell you, this is not someone who's doing it through convenience, political expediency. I think this is someone who really does believe what she's saying. Whether she'll get her proposals through, whether she'll be stopped by the courts, by her fellow MPs, by the civil service blob or whatever, remains to be seen. But I think this is someone who actually understands, and she said it at the dispatch box, the pace and scale of change has been wild, frankly, and has disorientated our communities, and we need to slow it down. And the element of people understanding that, you know, what's happening with the asylum hotels and people coming in and, you know, undocumented young men, etc. These are going to set off alarm bells, not because people are intrinsically kind of racist or bigoted or xenophobic, but because they look at that and think, actually, if the authorities, if the state cannot protect its own borders, the integrity of its own borders, which is one of the first duties, then why would we trust it to do anything else? So you know, I support what she's done. It's not perfect, but it's about as much as we could probably expect from the Labour Party at the moment. And just one final thing, if I can, and I touched earlier on the National Front and the 1970s, and we'd kind of moved away from that because you get to the 1990s, you know, the NF were active in the 70s, marching through areas of you know, high ethnic minority populations and so on. And then as we became a more tolerant society, and in the 90s, net immigration was generally the tens of thousands. And people felt, yeah, this is modest, this is manageable, it's being properly regulated. It almost disappeared as an issue in political discourse in our country. And then all of a sudden, the new global market starts to take effect. You have globalization really affecting working class communities. You get the rapid demographic change. You've got EU enlargement. And then all of a sudden the brakes come off and suddenly it becomes an issue again. I think that's a tragedy because we're now talking about it as an issue again, as a running sore in our politics when we've moved on from it. But it ain't because people on the ground have become more racist. It's because people in power simply didn't understand those people and didn't understand that if you do this in the way that you're doing it, there's going to be a reaction. That's the sad thing.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our discussion. Firstly, a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much. It's obviously very wide-ranging, but hopefully we've kind of started to grapple with it. Obviously, there's so much more that could be talked about, and maybe we'll do like a follow-up. But thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience. We have this room for a little while, so feel free to kind of chat and continue the discussion. But yeah, we've come to the end of the formal part.